Here's the exact secret, sitting at the very center of this entire story. In the 1950s, every single phone call in America had to pass through the hands of a living human being, a switchboard operator, almost always a young woman, sitting in a room full of cables and blinking lights, physically plugging a cord into a socket to connect your voice to the person you were calling. That operator could hear the first few seconds of your call before she finished the connection. She could hear you if you stayed on the line by accident. And in thousands of small towns across the country, she likely already knew your name, your husband's name, your children's names, who you were probably calling, and often exactly why. This was not a rare or scandalous exception hidden somewhere in the shadows. It was the basic, unavoidable architecture of the entire American telephone system for the better part of a century. And it means an entire generation of ordinary American women, largely invisible in most retellings of 1950s history, functioned as the quiet, mostly silent keepers of nearly every private secret in their community. This is the real story of what those women heard, how the system that put them there actually worked, why they kept what they heard to themselves, and precisely why this entire profession vanished so completely that most people alive today have never spoken to a switchboard operator in their life. To understand why operators heard what they heard, you first have to understand exactly how a manual telephone system physically worked, because it is genuinely different from anything in the modern world. When a customer in the 1950s picked up their phone, no dial tone connected them anywhere on its own. Lifting the receiver triggered a small light on a switchboard panel in a central telephone office, alerting an operator that a customer needed a connection. The operator plugged one end of a cord into the jack corresponding to that customer's line, said "number, please," and the customer told her, out loud, exactly who they wanted to reach. The operator then found the correct jack for that destination number, sometimes on her own board, sometimes routing the call through another operator entirely, if the destination was in a different town, and physically plugged the second end of the cord into that jack, completing an electrical circuit that let the two parties speak. In a small town, a single operator might personally handle every outgoing call for the entire community during her shift, which meant she was not merely a neutral piece of equipment. She was an active participant in every single connection, required to listen at least briefly to confirm the call had gone through correctly, and physically capable, whether she chose to or not, of continuing to listen for as long as the call lasted. This system explains why the job attracted such a specific type of employee, and telephone companies in this era were remarkably explicit and unapologetic about their hiring standards, in ways that would draw immediate legal challenges today. The Bell system and its regional affiliates overwhelmingly preferred to hire young, unmarried women, typically between the ages of 18 and 25, for switchboard positions, a preference rooted in several stated and unstated reasons, documented in company training materials and later historical research. Young women's voices were considered more pleasant and easier to understand over the relatively low audio quality of the era's telephone lines. Companies believed young, unmarried women were less likely to demand higher wages, since it was widely assumed a young woman's job was temporary until marriage, rather than a lifelong career. And frankly, the work required nimble fingers, sharp hearing, and long hours of sitting still under close supervision, conditions that management of the era believed young women would tolerate more readily than young men, who were steered instead toward technical repair and management roles within the same companies. Many phone companies required operators to be a specific minimum height so they could reach the higher rows of jacks on a tall switchboard panel without needing a stool, and some companies maintained strict rules requiring operators to resign immediately upon marriage, a policy that persisted at various companies well into the middle of the 20th century. The training these women received was surprisingly rigorous and heavily focused on discretion, precisely because the companies understood exactly how much sensitive information would pass through an operator's ears every single day. From a whispered argument between spouses to a doctor delivering grim news to a family member, all of it flowing directly past a young woman whose formal job description said nothing at all about being a confidant. New operators were drilled extensively on a formal code of professional silence, sometimes called the Operator's Code of Ethics in internal training documents, which explicitly instructed them never to repeat anything they overheard on a call, never to discuss customers' business with anyone, including their own families, and never to use information gained from a call for personal gain or gossip. This was not simply a suggestion. Operators who were caught gossiping about calls they had overheard, or worse, who were caught deliberately eavesdropping on calls out of simple curiosity, could be fired immediately, and telephone companies conducted periodic supervised checks specifically to catch and discourage this behavior. Supervisors, sometimes called chief operators, would occasionally plug quietly into a line themselves to verify that an operator was handling calls professionally and not lingering to listen in. The entire system rested on an enormous amount of institutional trust placed in very young employees. Trust that, by nearly every historical account, the vast majority of operators honored with remarkable seriousness, treating their position less like an ordinary job and more like something closer to a sworn professional confidence, not unlike a doctor or a lawyer, even though most of these women were barely out of high school. None of this meant operators heard nothing, or that small-town gossip through the switchboard never happened. Because human nature being what it is, the reality was considerably messier than the official rulebook suggested. In small rural communities especially, an operator often worked the same switchboard for years, sometimes decades, and simply could not avoid absorbing an enormous amount of casual knowledge about her community over that time, even without ever deliberately eavesdropping. She would notice, purely as an unavoidable side effect of her job, whose phone rang late at night, whose calls to the doctor's office happened with unusual frequency, whose long-distance calls to a certain city suddenly stopped or started at a particular time. Historians and journalists who have interviewed former switchboard operators decades after the profession disappeared have collected numerous first-hand accounts describing this exact tension. Operators who insisted they never deliberately eavesdropped, while simultaneously admitting they could not help absorbing an intimate, almost encyclopedic knowledge of who in their town was having an affair, who was in financial trouble, whose marriage was falling apart, and whose family had just received devastating news, often before that news had spread through any other channel in the community at all. This dynamic was especially pronounced on what were called party lines, a technology that deserves careful explanation because it is almost entirely unknown to anyone born after the 1970s. In many rural and even some urban areas through the 1950s, a single telephone line was shared by several separate households, sometimes as many as 10 or more on a single rural party line. Each household assigned a distinct ring pattern, for example, 2 short rings for one household, and 1 long ring followed by 1 short ring for another, so residents would know which calls were meant for them. The catch, and it was a catch everyone understood and largely tolerated as simply the price of having a phone at all in a low-density rural area, was that any household on the shared line could quietly lift their own receiver during someone else's call and listen in without the 2 talking parties necessarily knowing. This practice, commonly called rubbering or listening in the slang of the era, was widespread enough that telephone etiquette guides from the period explicitly addressed it, gently discouraging the habit while acknowledging its near universal presence in rural communities. Party lines meant that in many small towns, An operator was not even the primary source of overheard secrets. Neighbors were doing plenty of the eavesdropping themselves, directly, without any operator involved at all, which meant the switchboard operator was often simply the most professionally disciplined listener in an entire community where a great many people were listening. Operators also occupied a genuinely important, sometimes literally life-saving position within their communities that goes well beyond gossip. And this part of the story deserves real weight, because it is easy to reduce this profession to a story about overheard secrets and forget the far more serious responsibility that came bundled together with it. Before formal emergency dispatch systems existed in most of the country, and the nationwide 911 emergency number was not established until 1968 and took decades more to reach full national coverage. The local telephone operator was often the fastest and sometimes the only way to summon a doctor, the fire department, or help of any kind during a genuine emergency. A rural operator working a night shift alone might be the single person standing between a family and disaster during a house fire, a medical emergency, or a natural event like a flood or a severe storm. And numerous historical accounts describe operators who stayed at their switchboards for extraordinary stretches during regional emergencies, personally coordinating calls for help across an entire county with no automated system to assist them. This is precisely why the operator's discretion mattered so much to the community she served. She was trusted not simply because company policy demanded it, but because the entire community depended on her in moments of genuine crisis, and violating that trust for the sake of idle gossip would have permanently damaged something the whole town genuinely needed to function. Working conditions for these women were considerably harder than the glamorous red-lipped image on so many pieces of period advertising suggests. Operators typically worked in long shifts at a physically demanding station, seated upright for hours at a heavy switchboard panel, wearing a bulky headset, required to answer, connect, and disconnect calls at a strict pace measured and monitored by supervisors, with productivity quotas that companies tracked closely. Speaking was regulated down to the specific approved script. "Number, please," and later, "May I help you?" with company trainers actively correcting operators who deviated from the approved phrasing or tone. Bathroom breaks were often limited to specific scheduled windows, and operators could be disciplined for talking to each other during working hours, even during brief lulls between calls. These conditions eventually produced one of the more significant, if now largely forgotten, labor actions in American history: the 1919 telephone operators' strike, in which tens of thousands of unionized operators across New England walked off the job over wages and working conditions, successfully shutting down phone service across a large part of the region for several days and forcing the company to negotiate. A clear demonstration that these young women, often dismissed by management as temporary and interchangeable, held genuine collective power the moment they organized. The profession itself traces back further than most people realize, and its origin contains a specific, telling detail about why women came to dominate the job in the first place. The very first commercial telephone exchanges, in the late 1870s, actually employed teenage boys as operators, following the model already established by telegraph offices, which had long used boys as messengers and junior operators. This arrangement was abandoned remarkably quickly, within just a couple of years, because telephone company managers found that teenage boys, accustomed to the more informal culture of telegraph offices, were frequently rude to customers, prone to practical jokes on the switchboard, and generally difficult to discipline into the polite, patient manner the new telephone business required. In 1878, a young woman named Emma Nutt became the first female telephone operator in the United States, hired specifically because her calm, polite telephone manner so thoroughly outperformed her male predecessors that the company almost immediately began hiring women exclusively for the role, a hiring pattern that would then remain essentially unchanged in the American telephone industry for the next 80 years. The sheer scale of this workforce is worth pausing on, because it is easy to underestimate just how central these women were to the American economy of the era. At its peak, in the years following the Second World War, the Bell system alone employed several 100,000 switchboard operators nationwide, making telephone operating one of the largest single categories of female employment in the entire country outside of domestic service and factory work. And in many small and mid-sized American towns, the local telephone exchange was among the largest employers of women in the entire community, second only, perhaps, to a local school system or textile mill. This meant the switchboard operator was not some rare, exotic figure in 1950s America. She was an ordinary, familiar, almost universally recognized presence, someone nearly every American interacted with by voice on a near-daily basis, whether they ever learned her name or not. Which is precisely why her disappearance within a single generation represents such a significant, if quietly overlooked, disruption to an entire category of women's employment across the country. The physical workspace these women occupied deserves its own description, because the cord switchboard itself was a genuinely imposing piece of equipment. A typical manual switchboard panel stood roughly chest height, covered in row after row of small brass jacks, representing every telephone line the exchange served. With a thick tangle of rubber-coated cords, each tipped with a plug, hanging beneath the board, ready to be pulled up and inserted. A busy urban exchange might require an entire wall of these panels, staffed continuously by dozens of operators seated side by side, each managing her own section of jacks, with supervisors patrolling the floor behind them, listening for irregular pacing or unprofessional conduct. Cords could tangle, plugs could be pushed into the wrong jack during a rush of simultaneous calls, and operators developed a genuinely impressive physical dexterity, memorizing the layout of hundreds of jacks well enough to locate any one of them instantly without looking. A skill telephone companies specifically tested for during hiring, often using timed practical exams that measured how quickly an applicant could complete a series of practice connections. Party line culture generated its own rich, informal social etiquette that rural communities developed largely on their own, without any guidance from the telephone company, precisely because the technology forced neighbors into constant close proximity with each other's private conversations, whether anyone wanted that closeness or not. Unwritten rules spread through many rural communities, discouraging households from staying on a shared line too long if someone else clearly needed to make an urgent call. A courtesy enforced not by any company policy, but by simple neighborly pressure and the risk of being quietly gossiped about in return. Some communities developed informal signals, like a distinctive series of clicks, to politely indicate that a listening neighbor needed the line for an emergency. At the same time, oral histories collected from former party line users describe entire informal social networks built specifically around listening in. Women who coordinated recipe exchanges, church activities, or simply caught up on community news by half participating in calls that were not technically addressed to them. A practice so normalized in some small towns that it functioned less like spying and more like an informal, communal information network that every participant understood and, to some degree, tacitly accepted as the price of affordable rural telephone service. During the First World War, the United States Army recognized that the existing military telephone communication system on the Western Front in France was hampered badly by inexperienced male soldiers struggling to operate switchboards quickly and accurately under combat conditions. General John Pershing specifically requested that the Army recruit experienced bilingual female telephone operators from the Bell system to serve overseas, resulting in the creation of the Army Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit, popularly nicknamed the Hello Girls, more than 200 of whom served in France, often within range of German artillery, connecting urgent military calls with a speed and reliability that Army officers repeatedly praised in official reports. Remarkably, despite serving in uniform under military discipline and facing genuine wartime danger, these women were not formally recognized as veterans by the United States government until 1979, over 60 years after their service, a delay that historians studying women's military history describe as a direct reflection of how thoroughly the switchboard operator's labor, however essential, was undervalued and overlooked by the institutions that depended on it most. Wages for switchboard operators tell their own part of this story. Pay was generally modest, often set explicitly lower than wages for comparable, mostly male, technical roles within the same telephone companies, a disparity the companies of the era justified openly using the same reasoning applied to the hiring preference for young unmarried women, namely, the widespread assumption that a female employee's income was supplementary to a future husband's earnings, rather than a primary, lifelong wage a family might depend upon. Despite this modest pay, the job carried genuine social respectability in most communities. Considered a clean, indoor, relatively safe occupation compared to factory or domestic work. And it offered a defined, if narrow, path of advancement for women who remained in the industry. A skilled, reliable operator could be promoted to positions like supervisor, instructor training new hires, or chief operator managing an entire local exchange. Some of the very few management track positions available to women in mid-century corporate America at all. Which is part of why, despite the modest pay and demanding conditions, the profession attracted large numbers of ambitious young women in this era, with genuinely limited alternative career paths. It is worth walking through a few specific, well-documented examples of what operators actually did with the secrets they held, because the abstract description of discretion becomes more vivid with concrete cases historians have recorded through oral history projects and company archives. Multiple retired operators interviewed decades later described specific memorable incidents, recognizing a caller's distressed voice and quietly notifying a doctor before the caller even finished dialing, refusing point-blank to repeat gossip to a customer's inquiring in-laws, even when directly and repeatedly pressured to do so. And, in at least one frequently cited account, an operator in a small Midwestern town who noticed an elderly customer had not made her usual daily call to a relative and personally alerted a neighbor to check on her, a check that reportedly found the woman had suffered a medical emergency and likely would not have been discovered in time otherwise. These stories, impossible to verify with the same rigor as hard statistics, nonetheless appear across enough independent oral history collections from different regions of the country to represent a genuine, recurring pattern rather than a handful of isolated legends. And they explain a great deal about why so many small towns genuinely mourned the loss of their local operator once automatic dialing finally arrived. The telephone booth deserves a brief mention here too, since it developed as a direct architectural response to exactly the privacy concerns this entire story revolves around. As telephones spread into public spaces, drugstores, hotel lobbies, and train stations through the first half of the 20th century, the enclosed telephone booth, with its folding glass door, was specifically designed to give a caller at least the visual illusion of privacy from bystanders standing nearby, even though the call itself still passed through an operator's switchboard who could hear every word, regardless of how solid the booth's door happened to be. This slightly contradictory arrangement, physical privacy from the people standing a few feet away, combined with an almost complete absence of privacy from the person actually connecting the call, captures something important about how mid-century Americans thought about telephone privacy generally. Enormous attention paid to visible, physical discretion, and comparatively little formal concern about the invisible, institutional access an operator held by simple virtue of doing her job. The answer is direct dial automation, a technological shift that unfolded gradually over several decades, but accelerated dramatically through the middle of the 20th century. Automatic switching equipment using electromechanical devices originally patented as early as 1891 by an undertaker named Almond Strauger, who reportedly grew frustrated believing a human operator was deliberately routing his customers' calls to a competing funeral home, slowly replaced the need for a human operator to manually connect every single call. Strauger's invention allowed a rotary telephone dial to directly control mechanical switches inside the telephone exchange, letting a customer route their own call without speaking to anyone at all. This technology existed in limited form for decades before it truly transformed the industry, because installing automatic exchange equipment nationwide required enormous capital investment, and the Bell system rolled it out gradually, city by city, over a span of many decades, rather than all at once. The 1950s sat right in the middle of this massive, sometimes chaotic transition. And this is precisely why the profession looked so different by the end of the decade compared to the beginning. Major American cities converted to fully automatic dial systems throughout the 1940s and 50s, and the well-known introduction of all-number calling and standardized three-digit area codes in 1947 and 1948 was specifically designed to make direct, operator-free, long-distance dialing possible across the entire country, a project that culminated in nationwide direct distance dialing becoming widely available through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Rural areas, where the cost of installing automatic equipment was harder to justify against a smaller customer base, held on to manual switchboards and human operators considerably longer, in some especially remote communities, lasting into the 1970s and even beyond. Which is precisely why so much of the surviving nostalgic imagery and first-hand testimony about small-town operator culture comes specifically from rural America, rather than from major cities, where the profession had already largely vanished by the time the decade most associated with the switchboard operator, the 1950s, was actually underway. The economic logic behind this replacement was completely straightforward and entirely traceable. The same pattern that reshaped so much of mid-century American life. A human operator, however skilled, could only handle one call connection at a time and required a full salary, benefits, supervision, and a physical building to work in. Automatic switching equipment, once the substantial upfront capital cost was paid, could handle vastly more call volume continuously, without wages, without breaks, and without the risk of human error or, from the phone company's perspective, without the liability risk of an employee overhearing something sensitive. As the country's total call volume exploded through the post-war economic boom, manual switchboards and the human labor behind them simply could not scale to meet demand at anywhere near the same cost as automated equipment. The telephone company's own internal economic calculations, not any change in customer preference, drove the decision to phase out operators as quickly as capital investment allowed in each region, a pattern of automation replacing skilled human labor that would repeat itself in different forms across many other American industries in the decades that followed. There is also an important, less comfortable layer to this story, worth stating honestly rather than glossing over with pure nostalgia. The intimate knowledge these operators held over their communities existed entirely without the consent of the people being overheard, and it depended on a level of institutional trust that, however well it generally held up according to the historical record, still represented a genuine and largely unregulated privacy vulnerability by any modern standard. There were no legal wiretapping protections in the modern sense governing operator conduct through most of this era, no requirement for a warrant, and no meaningful legal recourse for a customer whose private conversation had been casually overheard by an operator or a nosy party-line neighbor. Modern privacy law, including legal protections against wiretapping that began strengthening significantly starting with federal legislation in the 1960s and 70s, exists in substantial part as a direct response to exactly this kind of unregulated access that characterized the early and mid-century telephone system. In that specific sense, the disappearance of the human switchboard operator, replaced first by automatic mechanical switching and later by fully digital systems, actually represents a meaningful improvement in ordinary citizens' communications privacy, even though it came at the cost of the very real, sometimes genuinely valuable, community trust and connection that a known, discreet, professionally bound human operator could provide in a way no machine ever could. Compare, finally, this entire American story to how Europe handled the same technological transition, because the contrast is genuinely revealing. Many European telephone systems in this era were run directly by national postal and telecommunications ministries, rather than by a private company like the American Bell system. And several European countries, constrained by more limited post-war reconstruction budgets, actually retained manual switchboards and human operators considerably longer than the United States did in most of its urban areas, in some cases well into the 1960s and 70s, even in fairly significant towns. This meant the specific, intimate, operator-knows-everyone dynamic described throughout this account persisted somewhat longer in parts of Western Europe than it did in the more rapidly automating American telephone system, a difference historians of technology attribute directly to differing levels of state versus private capital investment in telecommunications infrastructure on each side of the Atlantic, rather than to any meaningful cultural difference in how much either society valued privacy or efficiency. What remains true Whether in a small American town in 1955 or in a European village around the very same time, is that human beings have always found some way to know each other's business. Whether through a switchboard operator holding a cord, a neighbor quietly lifting a party line receiver, or the far more sophisticated and far less visible forms of data collection that define communication in the present day. The specific figure of the discreet, overworked, quietly all-knowing telephone operator will never return, because the mechanical and later digital infrastructure that made her necessary no longer exists in anything like its original form. But understanding exactly how she came to know so much, exactly how seriously most of these young women guarded what they knew, exactly why so many communities trusted her with their emergencies, their gossip, and their quiet daily rhythms, and exactly why automation eventually made her role economically unnecessary rather than simply outdated, offers something more valuable than simple nostalgia for a vanished profession. It offers a clear, evidence-based picture of how privacy, trust, and technology have always been quietly negotiated against one another. A negotiation that did not end the day the last manual switchboard in America was finally unplugged, and one that continues today, informs the operators of the 1950s, listening quietly through their headsets, connecting one voice to another by hand, could scarcely have imagined from behind their humming, blinking boards.